My name is Peter Andras. I am a professor at Edinburgh Napier University, and this is my lecture series on the evolution of complex systems. This is lecture 8, Politics and Law. This is part 2 of lecture 8. So in this lecture, we follow the previous part 1, where we discussed about the political system, and we defined the political system as the information subsystem of the society, which defines how actions of the society are implemented and how perceptions of society are performed, and which is essentially it is about the resource distribution in the society, where resources are all kinds of human communications, how these are managed within the society. Now, here we continue this by discussing further how politics is organized in society, what kind of institutional framework is there to implement politics. Then we move on to define the information subsystem within the system of politics, which we define as the legal system. Then we discuss the legal system, and finally we discuss identity violations and adaptations in the political and the legal system. So, as we discussed earlier, the political system is the system of all political communications which are aligned with the logic of power within the particular society, where the logic of power defines the political system of the society. This is the information subsystem of the society. Now, how this political system is organized matters a lot for the society, because this is how the resources are distributed. And in simple societies, the political system works by in sense of just generating political communications within the political system by a number of individuals. In general, all individuals participate, but some are participating more often. However, in complex states, as we noted, there are a number of institutions. So we will look at how these institutions, how this organization context provides the way of delivering the political system in these societies. So, in general, the political communications, as I said, they follow sharper continuation rules than the general communications within the human society. The structural constraints which apply to these communications provide this structuring. So these are the constraints which narrow the continuation distribution or sharpen the continuation rules. Now, these structural constraints together define the institutions and the state which delivers the political system. So the state is the organization within the society of the political system. Now, the communication is humans which specialize in the political communications. They contribute to the state, this system of this constrained system of rules, where through the system the constraints are applied and efficient communications within the political systems are achieved within the society. Now, these specialized communications, humans follow the rules of political communications to find detail. They generate mainly political communications. Now, just know that there are the politicians who are, as we noted, are again individuals who generate a lot of political communications, and most of the political communications are generated through politicians. There are a number of other specialized humans as well, which live or which generate their communication mainly in the context of the political system. These are the various advisors and other members of the of the teams of politicians who support the political decision making by the politicians. So if you look at current modern societies, you will find, for example, parliaments, parties, which contribute to the professional politics. They provide an organization framework for professional politics, and human individuals who generate communications within these contexts. They follow the political, the referencing and quotation rules of the political system, and they generate mainly political communications, although they themselves may not be necessarily seen as politicians. They exist within the context of these political system-related institutions like parties and parliament. So these institutions are the systematic rule sets that channel the political communications, the ones which constrain them, and also by having the communications in the context of these constraints and channels, they provide meaning to them. So effectively, communications which happen in the context of these institutions defined by these rule sets add by default additional reference by referencing the institutional setup where these communications are made. So if you like, you can see these institutions as coherent sets of constraints, where by coherence we mean that they are non-contradictory and they build on each other and they channel the same kind of communications in the context of the political systems. So, for example, you may consider a politician, an MP, who gives a speech in the parliament. And that has a political impact because it happens in the parliament. It means that the speech is interpreted in that context, and it will have an impact, possibly, for example, on the vote on a particular law, where may influence whether the law is passing, gets through the parliamentary vote or not. Or alternatively, you may consider the same speech given by the same MP, but at home, like a practice speech to the family. It is the same speech, so if you look at it in terms of what sentences are said, how they are structured, and so on, it is exactly the same as the speech done in the parliament. But this is a practice speech that happens before the speech in the parliament, and it has no such impact as the speech in the parliament. It is not happening in the parliament. So this institutional difference between where the communication is delivered adds additional meaning to the communications. That's the role of these political institutions. And the sum of these political institutions composes the state, which provides the environment for the delivery of the political system, of the actions and interpretations of the political system. So what you see here is that the institutions and the state, which is composed by these institutions, provides an additional referential framework where constraining the communications through the institution-specific rules, they add also meaning to these communications because all the communications which happen in a particular institutional context reference the institutional context as well by default. And in this way, if you like, the political communications get more specialized. They can expand more. They have longer continuations, and a more complex political system can be built if there are sufficient political institutions supporting it. Now, in the political system, of course, you have various subsystems which follow specialist political communications. So these might relate to particular political institutions, but the same institutional framework may also lead to formation of several subsystems. So, for example, if you consider that the elections as such of a specialist subsystem, it is very strictly defined. In the elections, you have certain communications where politicians advertise their political offerings, the ways how they would like to govern the country or the city and so on. And following these communications, the electorate, typically all or humans of sufficient age, they go and express their vote, which is a very narrowly specialized communication. Um, Typically, it happens by picking one or possibly more names from a list, by putting a mark next to the names that are picked. But essentially, it is a social communication. It's part of the society, and it is a very specialized political communication where the context that this making of a mark on a piece of paper happens in the context of the institution of elections adds important additional meaning to these communications, which otherwise would not be the case. Similarly, in the same institutional framework, like the parliament, may lead to the formation of multiple parties, which have different specialist communication languages, and which are the groups of politicians aiming to gain the popular support and majority in the parliament, so they can determine how the state works. So, in particular, if you look at parties, what you see is that they have specialized political communication. So, if you go, let's say, to the Labour Party, you will see a certain way of argumentation, certain topics of discussion. If you go to the Liberal Party, the Liberal Democrats in the UK, then you see another kind of language, different set of topics, which are the key topics of these communications. Quite often you find socialist, liberal, conservative parties, but you can find many others. In general, these are developed by ideologies, which are, again, it's a set of constraints of how you interpret communications, how you interpret communications in particular related to political power. And these ideologies can be driven by principled answers to social issues like socialism, liberalism, conservatism, or can be defined by regional, ethnic, racial identity, some kind of catch-all ideology which aims to maximize vote share, which is the case of many parties today, which are much less ideologically defined, and much more driven by the catch-all voter maximization objective. Or you can see various totalitarian parties as well, which aim to capture the whole society and politicize across the whole society and so on. In general, these parties aim to offer a way of managing the political power in the state and in the society. And through elections, they gather votes, and that establishes their popularity within the society, in democratic societies. And the most popular parties form the government. So in the elections provide this institutional context where kind of low-level political communications, expression of preferences for the various options of organizing the political decision-making in society are presented and are being chosen by all individuals in society who are of sufficient age or status to participate in the political system. However, as I noted earlier, it is a very simple communication act, the voting, but this institutional context adds very significant meaning to this simple communication. The elections lead to the choosing of the best fitting identity of the society, in the sense of choosing the party which represents the the society's preference about managing power within society. So overall, you have the linguistic identity of the society, which comes from the language of the society. Within that, you have the logic of power, which defines how is the political system organized within this society. Let's say it is a democratic society with elections and parties. And within this context, you have institutions like the parliament, where the political parties get their representatives. And among these parties, the society chooses which offers the best fitting identity for the society. Within the context of the other rules, within the context of the linguistic constraints, the logical power constraints, which options are the best to represent the identity of the society. So that leads to the formation of the parliament in such societies, which again, it is an institutional framework for the high-level political communication. So this is where the actual political decision-making happens to a good extent. Of course, the government itself is the executive element of the political decision-making. However, the framework for the governmental decisions are set by the parliament, and there the parties are presented according to the election results. And the dominant party or the dominant coalition is the one which represents the current most valid interpretation of the society, assuming that these elections are democratic and valid. Of course, it is possible that you have societies where you have these institutions, but the elections are falsified or altered, and then, of course, this discussion applies to less extent. Effectively, in those societies, the outcome of the elections is decided by those who are already in power, and they do not lead to changes, as in democratic societies, in the indicating changes in the views of the society about their identity. Now, if you look at identity violations in the political system, of course you see faults. These are political communications which do not fit the logic of politics or the logic of power. So, for example, if a would-be politician gives a speech about the right of penguins to wear guns, it's quite total nonsense. So, these kind of would-be political speeches will not be part of the political system and would be eliminated quite quickly from it. An error situations where there is a lack of political continuation communications. So, for example, people don't participate in elections. They have the right, by not participating, they express their view in the context of the election, but it is an error from the perspective of the political system where the expected continuations, the expected active expression of views through the elections is missing. And of course, you can have the failure where there is a massive shrinking of the political system due to faults and errors. And these often lead to revolution, where the political system is reformed fundamentally and it is replaced by a new political system. Now, adaptations to the identity violations. For example, the senseless speech politician gets marginalized in their party, or the parties change policies to gain more public support and more votes at the elections. The parliament changes the legislation in some respects. For example, legislates for to support more action against climate change, more action for energy reliability. And of course, in the case of failures, the revolution leads to the establishment of a new political system in the context of that society, which is expected to reflect more the actual preferences of the society and the actual view of the society of itself. Now, we talked about the parliament and the parties, and of course, all the parliaments do about is creating of laws. These laws are regulating the distribution of power within the society and within the state. These laws regulate the distribution of power in many ways. They regulate how disputes between neighbors are resolved. They regulate how education is organized. They regulate how doctors work, and many other areas of society are regulated through laws, which are the outcome of political discussions. Now, these laws, in general, reference actions and perceptions of the political system, communications within the political system, which lead to the voting and approval of these laws, which become approved. So, the laws today in most societies are made by the parliament. Of course, in the past, they would be made by the king or the queen, following advice from their advisors, the knights, and so on. In general, the laws in this way represent a reference to these political communications will lead to the establishment of these laws. We see there a number of examples, including all areas of life, including highway construction, penal procedures, and so on, which are all laws, all come out from the parliament, and all represent how the political system concludes to regulate distribution of resources within the society. Now, you will find also regulations in other social contexts, in all organizations, like schools or companies. There are regulations which are rules about the power distribution in these organizations. And these refer to the actions and perceptions of the power system within the organization. And these regulations constrain the political communications within these social systems, like organizations, companies, schools, and so on. So you can see this the same applies, or in the context of society, you are talking about rules. In the context of subsets of the society subsystems, you will have the similar function delivered through regulations. Now, the legal communications are the communications about laws, about the rules of power distribution. So, if you like, these legal communications are descriptions of the political system and reference of descriptions of the political system, the laws. So, the legal communications describe how the power distribution and the political system works, provide a model of the political system. So, for example, they define who may participate and to what extent in politics and in what ways. For example, who can vote, who can be voted in certain roles, and so on. They define criminal justice, which tells you if there are crimes committed, how those crimes are handled, how justice is delivered to those who suffer from those crimes, how criminals are punished. Or disputes about issues between neighbors. Again, it is regulated through laws, which is again a regulation of distribution of resources and what the rules of distribution of resources. Now, there are several kinds of legal communications. One is the making of the laws, which happens in the parliament, and these lead to the establishment of the fundamental legal communications, which are referenced later by further legal communications. The interpreting of the laws, which is done by lawyers and judges, who argue and communicate about the interpretation of the legislation, of the laws, how they should be applied, and what is their meaning. And because in many cases these interpretations are not necessarily straightforward, uh, a lot of legal communications are generated in the context of interpretation of laws. So, for example, if you look at all kinds of legal cases that happen through the courts, these are all about interpretations of laws, where lawyers argue their views of the interpretations and ultimately the judges settle the interpretations in each particular case. Then there is the application of laws, which happens mainly through various parts of the public administration, which is the application of laws, where they follow the laws and apply the provisions and implications of these laws. For example, about where they do the road repairs, how they block the traffic when road repair happens, and so on. If there are a dispute between neighbors, how they manage the resolution when the police gets out, how does that work, what do you do. These are all applications of the laws. And finally, complementing and modifying the laws, which can happen either in the parliament or in some countries like the UK and other Anglo-Saxon countries through the interpretation and modifying interpretation of the laws given the inputs from society. So typically when cases when legal cases reach the highest courts, it is possible that some interpretations are added which cannot be necessarily directly derived from the existing laws, but represent the views of the society and the interpretation of these laws in the current social context by these high court judges. So, for example, just a recent case in the US, the right for abortion by women is not part of the Constitution, and there is no law that would make that law across the US. However, this right was established through a Supreme Court judgment in the early 70s. And this judgment has been recently overturned, which means that in the early 70s, the judges interpreted the social context and the legal context in one way, while today they interpret it in a different way. In both cases, it led to a modification of effective modification of the laws without the involving of the parliament. Now, as I said, the legal communications in kind of abstract way describe how political communications are organized, how the power is managed. So these represent memories of these political communications. So if you think of all the communications which lead to the development of a new legislation, of a new law, which gets discussed in Parliament, gets modified there, and ultimately gets accepted and approved. Now, all these communications are represented by this final version of the law. So in a kind of abstract way, you can see this as essence of the memory of all these communications representing and referencing these communications. Now, in the same way, this legal communication law represents or facilitates the reproduction of communications as well, aligned with this the final interpretation of these political communications. In the same way, you can see other legal communications as well, which reference further legal communications laws, which ultimately reference all these background communications and lead to the application of the law, the generation of power distribution communications in accordance with the rules. So you can see the legal communications as memories of communications of the political system. So the legal system in this way can be seen as the information subsystem of the political system, because it is about processing memories of the political system. The legal communications reference laws and other legal communications, and ultimately they produce the information processing about the political system. So they constitute the information subsystem within the political system. The legal logic is the legal-illegal distinction. So what are the things that are legal and what are the things that are illegal? And when a communication can be framed in the legal-illegal distinction context, where it is relevant for this logic of distinction between legal and illegal. Legal are things that are following the laws, and illegal are those which do not follow the laws. These communications are legal communications, and this distinction defines the core of the legal system within the society. So the legal system's language is defined by the applicability of the legal logic. Those communications which fit this legal-illegal distinction, in the sense that it referencing this distinction makes sense for this communication, these are part of the legal system, while others which do not fit in this sense, for which this reference is not relevant, the reference to the legal-legal distinction, they are not legal communication. Again, there you will find very frequent communications which reference other legal communications, and relatively rare references to other communications that are not legal communication. They are always references to these other non-legal communications, because those provide the grounding of the legal system in the context of society. However, most of the communications between lawyers and judges, these are about interpretation of laws, these are about other communications about interpretations of laws. So as you can see, all these communications which are part of the legal system mainly reference other legal communications. And there is this dense boundary around the legal system. Now, the actions of the legal systems are communications within the legal systems that lead to changes of the model of power distribution. So the applications of a new law which solves previously unresolved issues, which leads to new legislation. That these are actions of the legal system. In the same way, you may also see actions of the legal system in terms of application of the legal system, where the legal system impacts the society, impacts how resources are distributed and used in the society. In general, all these actions must fit this legal distinction in the context of the existing legal system. They reference the rules and provide reference for further legal communications. The perceptions are the changes in the political and power distribution system which lead to changes in legal communications. So these are changes that trigger the changes in the legal system. So these are based on other social communications which lead to changes in the laws. So, for example, the extension of the voting rights, which reflected the perception of humans contributing the communications in the society at that time, that voting rights should be extended, let's say, from the very rich to the moderately rich, or from men to women as well. Of course, there are other perceptions of the legal system as well. These are in the context of other legal communications. For example, if you look at a trial, court case, there are references to other non-legal communications, behaviors of humans outside of the legal system, which uh, references lead to formation of perception in the context of legal system, which are formulations referencing these events in legal terms, and then these legal communications are further referenced to lead to some outcome of the legal system, which becomes an action of the legal system. Now, the meaningful communications within the legal system are those that fit the logic of the legal system, the legal distinction in terms of that distinction being relevant for the communication. And these are the ones which fit, which provide reference for further extensions. So, for example, the good application of laws, the general application of laws, which is the rule of law in the society, these are meaningful legal communications. The meaningless communications are the ones which do not fit the legal system. For example, revolutionary legislation where they confiscate property, which is against the legal system that is pre-existing there, which guarantees rights to property. Or corrupt judicial processes when the judges don't follow the rules and possibly are bribed, and they make judgments which do not fit the legal system. So these are faulty communications, or they are errors situations which ultimately lead to the undermining and potentially to destruction of the legal system by undermining trust in the legal system and undermining the application of the legal system. Now, if you look at the individuals, what you see is that everybody participates to some extent in the legal system. For example, buying a house, buying really any kind of product, be that some food or a TV. These are all involve legal processes. There are contracts signed which reference legislation, and these are all legal communications. And of course, there are the specialist communication units, specialist humans who do legal communications professionally. These are lawyers, judges, and various other people working with them who generate most of the legal communications. Now, the constitutional law is a particular part of the legal system, which is about the institutional framework of the politics, which is about the state, how the state is defined. Now, constitutions may exist explicitly, like in the US and in most European countries, where there is a constitution which defines what is the state, what are the institutions in the state, what are the fundamental rights, how the state and the rights work. Or it can be implicitly, like in the UK, where there are a number of laws which define how the society is organized, for example, how parliament, how the parties are organized. And all these together kind of implicitly constitute the constitution of the state. The constitutional law is the information system within the legal system. It describes how the legal lawmaking, how the legal system, and how the political system's action in terms of generating components of the legal system, how that works. This provides a model of the legal system. Constitutional law is relatively remote. There are relatively few people involved in generating communications for constitutional law. Typically, these are the highest judges in the highest court and lawyers appearing in the front of these judges, and possibly representatives of political institutions appearing in the front of these judges. Now, in the legal system, the identity violations can be false, like wrong application of the law when, let's say, a judge decides a money laundering CEO did not commit any crime, possibly because they are bribed. An error situation where the lack of constitutional legal correct communication is missing. So, for example, fines are issued, but they are not paid, and there is no consequence for. So, the expected legal communications about consequences are not there. Or the failure where the revolution stops the application of laws and the whole legal system collapses and the new legal system is created ultimately. In response to these identity violations, the legal system does adaptations. Incorrect judicial decisions are corrected, for example, after an appeal. Um, if the fines are not followed by payment of these fines, then changes are made, either reducing or eliminating the issuing of these fines, or other changes are made in order to possibly limit the number of fines and apply more clear way of following up when these are not paid. New laws introduced to deal with emerging important cases. So, for example, right now this is an issue, the abortion is an issue in the US, but there are a lot of issues related to environmental legislation, about energy legislation, which are currently important issues. And in case of revolutions, a new legal system will be built up after the revolution, when the political system is rebuilt and the corresponding legal system is rebuilt, which may involve retaining some parts of the older legal system, but possibly may involve a fundamental refresh and starting with new legal system. Right, to summarize, we discussed in this part of the lecture about the political system, and in particular how political institutions provide a framework for the political system, how communications within the political institutions frame these communications and provide additional reference to them. In particular, we note in the case of elections, where relatively simple communication of picking a name by picking a box gets very significant added meaning, added communication by the fact that it happens in the context of the elections, which is a key institution in democratic societies and democratic states. And we said that all these institutions together form the state within that particular society. We discussed about identity violations of politics and how adaptations lead to changes how the political system works. And then we moved on to discuss about laws. We said that parliament in democratic societies create laws which represent memories of all the political complications that lead to these laws. And then these laws provide the foundation for the legal communications, which are about the application of these laws, and which are essentially about how power, how the resource distribution within the society works, and these reference all the political communications. And we said that effectively, given that the laws and the legal communications ultimately reference memories of the political communications, these can be seen as the information subsystem of the political system. Finally, we mentioned the Constitution and constitutional law, which is the core information subsystem of the legal system, which describes how the legal system works, how the state institutions are organized, and how the legal system is created by the political system. And then we discussed briefly about identity violations and adaptations in the legal system as well. Finally, let's look at a few questions. First question, is it true that elections are meaningless in a democratic political system? And the answer is no. In a democratic political system which works properly, the elections are very meaningful. These are the ways of setting which particular view of the political system within the context of the democratic political system will become dominant, which will lead the legislation and the writing or modification of the rules in the next period of time. Next question, what about in a one-party system? So, for example, in communist country where there is just one party, the Communist Party is allowed. Well, these countries may have elections, but you can choose just representatives from a single party. So, in these countries, the elections are really meaningless because there is no real choice, and the outcome of the election does not change. The views of the political system does not change the way how the political system works, how political decision-making and legislation works. Second question, is it true that parties are professional institutions in the political system? And the answer is yes. The parties are organized around ideologies of all kinds. They represent ways of interpreting the perceptions and of the political system and ways of delivering the actions of the political system. People belonging to parties follow certain ways of communication, following certain topics that lead the discussions and the communications about political questions. And in this way, they are professional. They have a professional affiliation and professional way of generating their communications in the context of these parties. So, in that sense, the parties become professional institutions within the political system. Third question, is it true that political institutions add implicit meaning to communications by sharpening continuation distributions? And yes, that's what we said, that communications in the context of political institutions like elections or beginning a speech in the parliament or talking within a party conference add additional meaning to these communications. And this additional meaning and correlated structuring of communications helps the sharpening of continuation distributions and effectively helps the generation of longer sequences of communications and addressing of more complex problems in the context of political system. Finally, is it true that judges create actions of the legal system? Do they create also perceptions of it? And the answer is, for the first question, is yes. When the judges make decisions and the final ruling, they apply the laws, and the application of the laws lead to actions of the legal system, which lead to particular ways of distribution of resources in society. For example, it may lead to jailing of a criminal, or it may lead to the distribution of property between partners who go to the court over distribution of this property. Judges also, the second question, also have a yes answer, because they also create perceptions of the legal system. When they see, especially this is true in the Anglo-Saxon states, where the judges use precedents as another foundation of the rulings. And in this context, they look at ways of addressing problems that are not necessarily explicitly addressed by the rules, and they create potentially new interpretations which expand the original meaning of the rules. And in this way, the judges also create perceptions of the legal system. Thank you.